It seems that every country has a significant river that is a source of pride, strength, legends, recreation, and commerce for its people. We have the Mississippi, of course. Brazil has its Amazon, but perhaps the most important river in Russia is the Volga. And it's produced its own grand tradition of myths, legends, and folklore. A whole body of literature has come from Russia's relationship with this river, and among the more influential works was a play by Alexandra Ostrovsky entitled The Storm. Written in 1859 by a playwright who was also an enthusiastic champion of social reform, the play sought to reveal the bigoted, traditionalist ways of the merchant class and condemn the destructive power that such a lifestyle could have on the freedom of the individual. Ostrovsky's play influenced a Czech composer to write one of his greatest works. The composer, Leos Janácek. The opera, Katya Kabanova. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. Today we're in the Russian icon room of the Timken Museum of Art in San Diego to discuss the life and work of Leos Janácek. Janácek was a late bloomer. He didn't create his first major opera, Yenufá, until he was 50 years old, and all his greatest works were written in the last 10 years of his life. It wasn't until he started studying and arranging the folk music of his own Moravian culture that he began to become intensely interested in composition and finally in opera. In 1888, he was invited to participate in the collection of folk songs throughout Moravia and parts of Slovakia, and it was this process that initiated his theory about the intimate connection between speech patterns and music. It was during this period that he began writing his first opera, Šárka, an unremittingly romantic opera dealing with Czech mythology. Then followed Poteček Romanu, an opera based entirely on folk songs and dances of Moravia. But it was during the composition of Yenufá, a process of about 5 years, that his ideas about opera began to gel and his musical personality began to mature. The opera Osud followed, a semi-autobiographical work about a composer, and then the very satirical Excursions of Mr. Bruček, the only opera of his that would have a premiere at the National Theatre in Prague. It was with Katya Kabanova, however, that Janácek took complete control over his librettos, and the composition of his operas progressed much more smoothly. But other more personal issues intervened during the development of his compositional style. Janácek had married one of his piano students when he was quite young and while still teaching at the Institute. The marriage experienced many difficulties, but something else changed at this time. A chance meeting in 1917 with a woman who was to become his muse and through whom he found the inspiration that compelled him to write his greatest works. In 1917, while Janácek was taking his usual few summer weeks of vacation at the Moravian spa town Luhačovice, he met a woman 38 years his junior, Kamila Strslova. Kamila was the young wife of a merchant visiting the spa at the same time, and from his first meeting with her he experienced a profound sense of love, as well as the feeling that she was destined to become his inspiration. The relationship, which put a great strain on his marriage, was to last for the rest of his life and is chronicled through an extensive correspondence, more than 700 letters that they exchanged with one another. We know that the relationship, however intense emotionally, was probably somewhat one-sided and was never consummated. Even so, the meeting of the composer with Kamila Strslova coincides with a great flowering of creativity in his work. Throughout the rest of his life, Janácek would constantly point to Kamila as his inspiration. And certainly Katya, the first full work written under the influence of this relationship, was a result of the composer's obsessive identification of the heroine, Katya, with his new friend. The Russian play The Storm by Alexandra Ostrovsky, suggested to Janácek by a theatrical producer in 1919, struck the composer with potential because the play had all of the elements that Janácek found important for opera: a story of deeply conflicted characters, a dark claustrophobic atmosphere, and focus on an individual struggling against the immovable social forces that surround her. The composer adapted The Storm himself, paring it down from its classical 5-act structure to an economical 3 very short acts with 2 scenes each. Unnecessary characters were written out of the action, as Janácek wished to center the action on 3 couples in the harsh environment of a riverside village in Tsarist Russia. The first couple consists of the old widow Kabanova and her friend Decoy, who symbolize the merchant class. These are purveyors of a hypocritical, traditionalist morality. Katya, her daughter-in-law, and the villager Boris are the second couple. Katya yearns for freedom, and she finds it in Boris, who is the only person in the village who represents an opportunity for escape. He's well-educated, cosmopolitan, and someone with whom she has an affair. Finally, we have the peasant couple, Kudryas and Varvara, who freely love each other without constraint and eventually free themselves from the oppressive village by running away to Moscow. Katya, the central figure in the opera, is dominated and ultimately crushed by the stifling morality of her mother-in-law and by her own guilt. In every scene, the Volga flows inexorably by, acting as a kind of symbol of the forces that Katya must struggle against. Katya premiered in Brno on November 23, 1922, and Janácek dedicated the opera to his muse, Kamila. But wishing to keep her distance, she didn't see the opera herself until much later, close to the end of Janácek's life in 1928. His passion for her never waned, and we can experience the intensity of feeling for ourselves in every bar of Katya Kabanova. As the curtain goes up, the merchant Decoy is rebuking his nephew Boris for his lack of ambition, and then goes looking for Kabanova, the widow who is at the center and the dominant force of the Kabanov family. Boris reveals to his friend Kudryas that he has fallen in love with Katya, the daughter-in-law of Kabanova, and soon after, the Kabanov family circle is seen returning from church. Katya, her husband Tikhon, his mother, the widow Kabanova, and Varvara, the foster daughter. Kabanova complains to her son that he is neglecting her in favor of his wife and demands that he leave on a 10-day trip to the market in faraway Kazan. She humiliates Katya by dictating how she should behave in her husband's absence and then leaves them alone for a moment to make their goodbyes. They have nothing to say to each other. In Act 2, we see the widow Kabanova embroidering with Katya and blaming her daughter-in-law for not observing proper decorum while her husband is away. After Kabanova retires, Varvara enters, giving Katya a key to the garden gate. She tells Katya that she will ask Boris to meet her at the gate, and it is obvious from the music that Katya is experiencing a crisis of conscience. In the next scene, it is night, and a beautiful quartet ensues comprised of the lovers Kudryas and Varvara, Boris and Katya. At the end of it, Boris and Katya go beyond the gate and into the garden to make love. Act 3 finds the town engulfed in a major summer storm, and various characters take refuge in an old ruined church. As the storm dies down, Varvara enters, then Boris. She warns him that Katya's husband has returned from Kazan, and in her guilt she's threatening to confess everything. When Katya arrives, she is obviously distracted and upset, and Boris and Kudryas hide from her. But Katya breaks down, falls to her knees, and confesses her infidelity to everyone. Kabanova demands the name of her lover, and after Katya names Boris, she falls senseless into her husband's arms. As the storm renews its power, she breaks away and runs out into the darkness. And in the final scene, the peasant couple, Kudryas and Varvara, decide to escape all this and go to Moscow. Katya enters alone, and in a searing aria, she expresses her regret over her confession, with only a loveless marriage to look forward to in the future. Boris has been sent to Siberia, and he comes to her to say farewell over the sound of the Volga, mournfully sighing in the distance. Finally alone, Katya flings herself into the river. What better way to discuss an opera composer than to invite another opera composer to talk about Janácek, and I'm delighted to invite our friend Myron Fink to be part of our Opera Talk today on Katya Kabanova.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Myron. I'd like to back up a little bit, though, before we start talking about Janácek. Let's place him in context of what was going on with Eastern European art music at the turn of the 20th century, the late 19th century. What was going on?
Well, of course, the whole 19th century had seen a tremendous influx of music from Eastern Europe. If you think of the Liszt Hungarian Rhapsodies, the Brahms Hungarian dances, and another example is a half French, half Polish composer named Frédéric Chopin. But at the turn of the 20th century, it was already established that Eastern Europe was as musically potent a force as Western Europe. And in particular, there are three Bohemian composers who are at the forefront, and that's, of course, Smetana, Dvorak, and Janácek, who are the three most prominent Bohemian composers.
Dvorak probably being the most prominent
Yes,
of the
absolutely.
who himself wrote quite a few operas.
Quite a number of operas. They're, I don't think, done very much, except the one, Rusalka, which was done here at San Diego Opera some time ago. Absolutely marvelous.
Wonderful piece. Now, and Smetana also wrote certainly The Bartered Bride, we know very well.
And a large number of operas, which are, I think, almost never done outside of his native Bohemia.
We were talking earlier about the fact that many of these Czech operas, because of the language difficulty, touring, you know, the language traveling, that they were all translated into German and were done in German in the German-speaking countries.
Absolutely. I remember the Hamburg Opera came to New York, I think in the 70s, and they did Jenufa, which is Janácek's first opera, in German, of course, and we are told always that the rhythm, the Czech language, is at the basis of Janácek's treatment of the voice and of the way he sets the words, but not being a native Czech speaker, I don't know. As you say, it was done in German.
Yeah.
So.
Now, the one thing that ties these three composers together is their rootedness in the folk music.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't know how much of a formal study that Dvorak or Smetana did of the folk music of their own country, but it certainly is there. The rhythms, the myths of the country, the legends, this is all part and parcel of the 19th century nationalism.
Absolutely. And also a part and parcel of the romanticism of the 19th century, because, I mean, there's so many pieces of Dvorak and Smetana that celebrate nature. And in the case of Smetana, that celebrate the life of the peasant. And they were very rooted in their homeland. They were very fond of their country. They loved it. They were passionate about it.
So from that, can we deduce that Janácek also was interested in the folk music of Moravia, which is where he was from?
Where he was from. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it certainly is clear. But it's absolutely true that the nature of the folk tunes permeate the music of his operas.
Mm-hmm. So drawing from that, what's fascinating to me by listening and getting to know Katya particularly, yes, you do pick up occasional folk elements, folk song elements. In fact, there are quoted folk songs in the piece.
Yes.
But beyond that, Janácek's style is so economical, it's so spare and so to the point. And another thing that I notice about Janácek is that you hear a couple of bars of this man's music and you know them immediately. How do you account for that?
Well, I think there's a particular way. It would be hard to discuss it without becoming too technical, but some of the turns of melody, where the melodic line goes up or goes down or repeats, are uniquely his own. There are patterns there that you do not find in any other composer. Also, it's the harmony, the chords underneath, of which move in a way that sounds strange if you've grown up with Smetana and Dvorak, which is, of course, the way most people come to Czech music. And I think that accounts for it. But also, as you say, it's the spareness of the texture. Nothing really gets in the way. He doesn't dwell on melodies. And as we were discussing before, you have this glorious tune, and that's it, folks. You'll never hear it again.
It comes from nowhere.
It comes from nowhere.
Just appears.
Absolutely.
And disappears.
Right.
And it keeps us rather on the edge of our seats.
That's right. And of course, when you think about the dominant influence in 19th century opera, which is Richard Wagner, where you have leitmotifs, motives that come and come and come over 4 evenings. And this is as far removed from that world as you can imagine.
It's really amazing, isn't it, that a man who essentially began his training and his work as an organist, worked until he was 50 years old before he wrote his first opera, and then was writing until his 70s. Right. It's an amazing story.
It's an astonishing thing. I mean, that the desire to write opera can be sort of nascent, stillborn for so long, and then suddenly flourish. I mean, it's an amazing achievement.
Myron, thanks for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Janácek's works are all built from a few initial motives or cells that are introduced at the beginning, and Katya is no exception. He had sketched an overture early on in the process of writing the piece, but he discarded it in favor of writing the overture after the opera had been essentially completed. That way, he could use some of the tunes that he used in the body of the opera as a way of introducing it. The first truly obvious motive appears in the 5th bar of the overture, a kind of fate motive, although the use of that term is far too specific for the way the idea is used in the opera. It's played clearly and forcefully by the timpani. Now that's a pretty simple motive. 8 consecutive notes made up of only 2 pitches, F and B flat. Also, I've played only the bare motive for you. Listen to how it works as we approach it from the very beginning of the overture. That timpani motive appears numerous times throughout the opera, but especially when the composer wants to emphasize certain dramatic points. Most notably, it occurs at the end of Act 1, when Katya's husband Tikhon leaves for Kazan, the event that ultimately leads to her downfall. And you guessed it, at the very end of the opera, after Katya has thrown herself into the Volga, and as the mother-in-law stands over her corpse with an attitude of feigned sorrow. But these same notes, F and B flat, are also used to create another motive, associated with the sleigh bells on the horses of the carriage that takes Tikhon away. And we hear this motive again first in the overture. This too appears naturally enough when Tikhon takes his leave, and broken up and barely recognizable during the final scene of the opera. One of the most lyrical and overtly beautiful themes in the opera is heard during the entrance of Katya in Act 1, and so it's associated with her character throughout the entire piece. Notice how it acts almost like the appearance of Cho-Cho-san in Puccini's Madama Butterfly, one of Janácek's favorite operas. Each entrance of the tune is a step higher, intensifying the impact of her introduction to the audience. This tune as well appears more than once in the score, but every time it appears, the composer varies it in order to give it subsequently more ambiguous meanings. It appears briefly during Katya's aria in the second scene of the first act, when she's describing her childhood and deeply expressing her desire for freedom. We hear snippets of it again at the end of the same scene. But listen to how this same theme has blossomed as we hear it at the climax of her duet with Boris, the wonderful love duet in Act 2. It even appears again, tragically, during her last moments, asking, "What is there left to live for?" These are such short, pithy, but highly charged moments, all integrally connected to each other. I give you these examples just to let you into the complex world that is Leos Janácek. But take heart, these are not things that you need to know in order to enjoy the opera. The music is so intuitive, so well crafted, that it works without the listener even knowing it, telling the story clearly, but with great subtlety at the same time, making Katya Kabanova a unique emotional experience. Since Katya is a work that's not often performed in the United States, it would really help you out to get to know the work before you see it in the theater. There are two wonderful recordings of Katya available. Both of them, interestingly enough, are conducted by Sir Charles Mackerras, who's made something of a specialty out of conducting Janácek. The first one stars Elisabeth Söderström as Katya. This is a searing and intense performance. A much more recent performance is the one with Gabriela Benáčková, a Czech native, of course, singing the role of Katya, and she's also quite good. There are many other recordings of operas by Janácek. I'd like to direct you towards Elisabeth Söderström's recording of Jénufa, which is Janácek's other great masterpiece. This also is conducted by Sir Charles Mackerras. And another fascinating tidbit is the fact that now we have Janácek's very first opera on record, Šárka, which is based on an old Czech myth. It's in the 19th century romantic vein of early Janácek. There are some books that can be found, but most of them in libraries. They're not particularly in print right now, and one of them, one of my favorites, is Janácek's Tragic Operas by Michael Ewan. I gained an awful lot of information on Katya by reading this book. Luckily, there is also a DVD available of the opera Katya. This from the Glyndebourne production of about 10 or 12 years ago, starring Nancy Gustafsson. All of these resources hopefully are readily available, and you'll be able to get to know Katya before you see it in the theater. Katya Kabanova is a work by a composer with a unique voice whose scores are immediately recognizable as his. But more than that, this is a work of searing intensity and gripping emotional power. I know you won't want to miss it. I'm Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.